Bitcoin trading at $73,500 smashing its former all-time high at $69,000 with a performance of 71% in 2024 alone. And if you want to believe social media, there is no end to this meteoric rise and increase in price. We should see a $100,000 before the halving already, which by the way is going to take place in a month from the time I'm recording this video. Later on, we should see 200,000, 300,000, 500,000 or even $1 million per Bitcoin in 2025. However, if there's one thing that I've learned in the past 25 years from investing and trading, it is if everybody is screaming into one direction, probably the opposite is going to happen. That's why today I want to share with you my personal Bitcoin exit strategy, the indicators and the data that I personally am looking at to determine whether we have already reached the top, when we have reached the top, and how I am planning to scale out of the markets to take my chips off the table. It's going to be an exciting video. Stay tuned. I'm going to see you in 10 seconds. Hey everybody, welcome back. Good to see you. Now, before we start, and you know what's coming now, please leave me a like and subscribe to my channel. I publish a new video about trading and investing from the eyes of a professional trader investor every week on Thursday. Also, if you want to support my work, you will find some links to, for example, crypto exchanges and other great tools for trading and investing in the description of this video. But now, without further ado, let's jump right into the metrics that I personally use to determine, is the price of Bitcoin already too high? Are we due for a correction? And how am I planning to scale out of the markets? How am I planning to take my chips, so to say, off the table? Now, everything I'm going to tell you here, of course, is no financial advice by all means. And if you are, so to say, a super hodler, meaning you never want to sell your Bitcoin, well, then you can just turn off this video and ignore everything. I also have a stash of Bitcoin, which I never plan on selling. However, I, of course, as an investor in trading, also have a position where I plan to take chips off the table to then probably later on, when the price is lower, reinvest it in Bitcoin. One metric that I have grown really fond of in the past years is the so-called Bitcoin price color coded by risk levels. This is a chart provided by a website called Into the Cryptoverse. I'm going to leave a link to them also in the description of this video. I'm not affiliated with them. It's highly, highly recommended that you pay them a visit. Great tools to really get this in-depth look into the market. Also tools that you do not find anywhere else, in my opinion. Now, one thing you'll notice about this chart is immediately that you'll see blue dots ranging up to red dots. And these, now the blue dots are the ones that are more into the blue area, like here, here, and here. These are times where the risk of Bitcoin for the price going down is lower than when we are in region where the dots turn yellow, orange, or later on even red. And you can see that works actually very well, because every time those dots turn red, eventually there's a correction to the downside. Every time they turn dark blue, this is pretty much always, has always been close to the bottom of the market. Now, one thing I want you to notice is the following. If I just show you now the high risk levels, so everything above 0.7 to 1.0, you will notice that these gave a very good indication of where the top of a market could be. And another thing that I want you to notice is that in the past days, we've actually entered this region of orange dots. Now, that alone does, of course, not mean that we are immediately inbound for a correction. However, this just means that the risk of a correction, historically speaking, is much, much higher than when we were, for example, at 50,000 or 20,000 or at 16,000. You can see, as a matter of fact, whenever those orange dots start forming here in 2011, 2013, 2014, the bull market of 2018 and 2020. As a matter of fact, very often the market kept on rising. So what we want to do now is maybe not look at the orange dot, but look at the levels of 0.8 and upwards. So the red dots and the dark red dots. And you can see we are not yet there because we are in this range of 0.7. As a matter of fact, we are at 0.74. So a little bit somewhere in the middle of 0.7. However, if we reach this 0.8 level or even the 0.9 level, this is almost always very, very the top or very, very close to the top. So what I'm planning to do here is, no, 0.7 is not yet an indication for me to sell, but should we see prices of 0.8 and upwards, this would be a clear signal for me that probably at least a local top is inbound. What a local top means in terms of where the price could retrace when, we are going to have a look at that, of course, later as well. And we can go here, actually, we can have a look at also where would be this area. So you can see here 0.74, as I said, right now is the price of around about 73,300. This level of 0.8 currently would be if the price today would rise to 83,150. 0.9, so the almost highest risk level there is already is, and this is quite a coincidence, isn't it, 101,000. So this is very close to those 100,000 US dollars that everybody on Twitter, on Reddit, and you name it, is screaming at the moment. Now, another thing I want to notice you here is how much time we've spent in those risk bands historically speaking. So, for example, this region of between 0.7 and 0.8, out of all days Bitcoin has been on the market, only 2.7% of those days were spent in this risk band. Even worse, with a risk level above 0.8, we only had 1.59% of all days spent in this risk level. So this is really outside at the extremes. The other extreme, of course, would be if the markets turn like this really dark blue, so the lowest risk levels, we've also spent only 2.7%. And as you can see, whenever we were dark blue, it was a good time in buying because the price sooner or later would rise again. It doesn't mean you can time the exact bottom, of course. You can also not time the exact top. You gotta be lucky in order to do that. Every time we saw those really dark red dots forming or orange forming, we were actually very close to the top. So this is an indication that maybe we are soon inbound, at least for a correction, for a so-called local top, so for a correction of maybe 20 or 30% to the downside. So this is the first thing I'm looking at currently. The next thing is, and this is something we didn't have the last cycles, are the Bitcoin Spot ETFs. I like to look on a daily level how much net inflows we saw into the Bitcoin Spot ETFs. Yesterday, which was the 13th of March, for example, we saw net inflows of 684 roundabout million US dollars going into the Bitcoin Spot ETF. The day before, the 12th of March, even 1 billion US dollars flowing into the Bitcoin Spot ETF. So this is, of course, generating a lot of demand. And you can actually see I marked here since the 14th of February all the days where we saw net inflows into the Bitcoin Spot ETFs of above 400 million US dollars. And you can see almost always on those days, we also saw those really nice, strong green candles, with the exception of 2 days. The first one was when we cracked, or were about to crack the last all-time high at 69,000 US dollars. We had this weird day, where Coinbase suddenly stopped trading for its clients, and we saw the price going down by 15% just to recover then within the next 3 days again. Now, why is this interesting? Because for me, very important and a clear indication, at least for me, that we might have reached a top would be if we see large inflows, for example, of those 680 million US dollars like we saw yesterday, but the price doesn't do anything anymore. So it kind of stays stagnant, maybe even falls a bit, because that would be an indication for me that the demand at the moment is not in balance with the supply anymore. So probably there is more pressure from the supply side than even the Bitcoin spot ETFs can scoop up on a daily. That would be a clear indication for me that we would see a local top. That does not mean that immediately we would correct like to 20,000 again or enter a bear market, but it would be an indication that we could see something like a local top with a drawdown then by, let's say, 20 or 30%. And if I have a look here at when were the last times we saw those drawdowns in this bull markets, we've seen the time between those local lows. So the first one here being in March 2023, then in June 2023, next one in September 2023, and the last one we saw end of January of 2024. We've spent between 13 and 19 weeks between those lows, so from one local low to another local low. Now, if I fast forward 13 weeks or to 19 weeks from the last low we saw here in the end of January, we actually land exactly at the time of a halving or a couple of weeks after the halving. And this matches very well into this narrative or into what we've seen after the last halving. So for example, here in 2020, we saw after the halving an extended sideways range of about 78 days. So about, almost 3 months, 2.5 months, to be more precise, until the market started moving up again. Same picture here in 2016. After the halving of 2016, actually we saw quite a significant bear market again with prices dropping, and it took 150 days almost to break out and really start the bull market. So this is potentially something that we also could see happening this time. And what that means, like to get a feeling of where the price could reverse then is actually that the price tends to approach its so-called bull market support bands. Bull market support band, that's the red and yellow line here, 20 days, the red one being a 21 weeks, exponential moving average, the yellow one being a 20 weeks simple moving average. And if price would, for example, reverse now, or let's say we stay at these levels we are seeing right now until the halving in a month, we're probably going to do that, but let's just pretend, then we could see price reversing by currently about 30% until we would actually touch those bull market support bands again. That would put us back, by the way, to around about 50 to 52,000 US dollars. So I'm asking myself, of course, all these inflows we are seeing currently into the Bitcoin spot ETFs that for sure generate demand, that have generated all those nice deep green candles that we've seen in the past months, really. What would happen if that reverses? Because you gotta remember, all those people, or most of the people that have invested in those Bitcoin spot ETFs, they are not used to being invested in an asset class that can crash by 15, 20 or 30% within a matter of days or sometimes even hours. And we've seen, so that means we could potentially also then see nervous investors in those Bitcoin spot ETFs pulling out their money again. And I bet you if the market is already crashing a little bit or performing more to the downside, and you see net outflows out of those Bitcoin spot ETFs of 400 or 500 million US dollars, then it's going to make things to the downside even worse. When this is going to happen, we don't know yet. The price still could, of course, go to 80,000, 90,000, 100,000, 150,000. That is very well possible. However, I am starting to become a little bit cautious, and this is why I'm starting to watch more closely this Bitcoin price color-coded by a risk level chart, especially the area above 0.8%, which will come in play once we go over 80,000 US dollars. And I'm watching very closely on a daily level those Bitcoin spot ETF inflows. And once I start seeing, for example, for a couple of days that there are large inflows of 400, 500, 600 million US dollars or even $1 billion US dollars, but price really doesn't do much to the upside anymore, or even with those inflows coming in, price corrects to the downside, this would be a clear indication for me that the market is about to form a local top, and the likelihood of a market correcting then by at least 20 or 30% to the downside is for sure there. Now, if you do not want to follow this on a daily level by yourself, you can, of course, weekly drop by my channel. I'm for sure going to do a video when we have reached those levels where I tell you then, okay, now I've taken my chips off the table. I've sold a portion of my Bitcoin. I'm also going to inform you on Twitter about this. So if you haven't done that already, give me a follow on Twitter as well. Yeah, let's see how things play out. This is what I'm looking at least at, and for you things of course can be totally different, but that's the nice thing about trading and investment. Everybody kind of has their own strategy. If you enjoyed this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'm going to see you again latest next week. Until then, happy investing.